Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here. Welcome to Mobile People Seminars. This seminar series is the product of a project called Mobile People at Queen Mary University of London, Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, and based in international politics and international relations school. We have 21 PhD students who have been admitted over the last 4 years, and their research focus on politics of mobility. And in that category, politics of mobility, we have researchers doing research on borders, politics of borders, European borders, external borders, internal borders, but not interior borders. We're going to learn about it today. And these 21 PhD students really established the backbone of this program. They're fascinating research projects, and in the invitation, I have included the link to look at the website and all those PhD projects, which will finish somewhere between now and 2023, 2024. I'm delighted to welcome and Laura Stoller today to do a seminar for us on interior borders, which is a fascinating concept with fascinating history, as she recounts it in a couple of her writings. But I just want to tell a few things about Anne and why she is just so absolutely a great speaker to have in our series. You may not know that she is a Willy Brandt Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research, as well as the founding director of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. Now, over the last 30 years, Anne has made an iconic contribution to politics of knowledge, colonial governance, racial epistemologies, the sexual politics of empire, and ethnography of the archives, and all based on joining conceptual and historical research. So it is a fantastic and fascinating contribution to the ways in which really we understand coloniality. And coloniality, particularly two themes, I think have been pertinent in her work. If I may be permitted to be bold to just suggest that two themes. One of them is imperial remains. What Anne's work really meant to me over the last 30 years, and I've been reading her since 1995 with the publication of Race and the Education of Desire, because I was interested in Foucault at that time and doing myself work in the archives, and that book was really an eye-opener, a companion, an inspiration. Two themes. One, imperial remains. Key thing that I always appreciated and admired in Anne's work is that unlike the grand narratives of the end of empire and the birth of the nation state to define modernity, she insists that imperial remains. And we find that in the remains of imperial forms of government. This has been really a significant aspect of seeing in the history of the present, in the contemporary, the imperial is not something that has ended. Coloniality are not just simply located in particular spaces, but in fact they are part and parcel of the history of the present, and they remain within our colonial, post-colonial relationships. This has been really significant. But the second theme, similarly so significant, is that in these imperial remains, governing intimacy is an essential and fundamental aspect of colonial government. So when we say colonial government, it's not only about institutions, it's not only organizations, it's not about ideologies and hegemony and so on, as important as they are, but coloniality persists. The imperial remains, particularly because it manages intimacy, governs sexuality. And in the way in which these relationships are governed, then the distribution of race and racialization, the distribution of patterns of domination and relations of power actually are performed, actuated, and brought into being. So intimacy is not an additional interest, but at the fundamental core of how the imperial remains and how we govern ourselves. The two put together provides, in my view, a powerful perspective from which to understand not only the way in which power functions in modern societies, but also how it is changing. It's not remaining static. And Anne's work has been quite nuanced and attentive to these changes. So it has not remained static over the last 30 years, as her latest book also indicates. She has written a number of books that are around these themes that I have mentioned. I already mentioned Race and Education of Desire in 1995, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power in 2002, Along the Archival Grain, again, Epistemic Anxieties and Colonial Common Sense, how the archives and governing intimacy has produced, and Duress, Imperial Durabilities of Our Times. She has done also really significant collaborative work with historians, literary scholars, and philosophers, most recently in the creation of journal Political Concepts, which I recommend everyone to visit the website, as well as being the founding editor of that. She has edited, together with a number of colleagues, with Thinking with Balibar, which is really a significant contribution, and Political Concepts, a critical lexicon coming from the journal as well as the website itself. So I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce Anne, and I really look forward to her discussion of interior frontiers. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Engin. I feel like I don't have to say anything anymore, but respond to such a beautiful articulation of so much that I care about, but also that I'm trying to push further now. So where do I begin? I was going to discuss the actual essay, Interior Frontiers, but it's been reproduced in so many different places and is sort of the key essay of the book that I decided not to go there. Instead, I want to offer a kind of arc of the book and what I mean by interior as interiority and as internal as well. The book is actually a set of essays, an attempt to navigate the shadows and shadow zones of democratic polities that considers how imperial features are folded through liberal and illiberal orders, not separate entities, as I suggested over 20 years ago, metropole and colony, which so much work came out on over the last few decades. The work that I did with Fred Cooper, this was off a conference with an extraordinary set of people, Patrick Chatterjee, Sidney Mintz. It was sort of miraculous. We fought the whole time. But it's more where racial inequities thicken in the borderlands of interior frontiers. Sometimes these frontiers, or the spaces that define the contours of belonging and not belonging, are porous, often fixed and firm. Entry requirements can be opaque, neither verbal nor visible. Illegibilities are secured in code. We can talk about what that means, that illegibilities are not there for you to understand immediately. The sights and sensibilities through which inequities work are disparate. Borrowing Ralph Ellison's phrase, I look to unexpected sights and scenes that register those lower frequencies, as he put it so beautifully, of difference and denigration. So I start with, this is the Oxford wanted to call it a prologue, but it's more than a prologue. And I changed, I've fought with Oxford over time, change it to Unquiet in the Polis, because I think that is much more accurate about the kinds of things I'm trying to touch on. And I start with a quote, as many do of Nietzsche, but I don't know many who start with this quote. It takes strength to be able to live and to forget the extent to which to live and to be unjust is one and the same thing. I think that's a kind of extraordinary quote and for us to remember today. Colonialisms stamp themselves into bodies, into minds, in the creases of skin, in the pores of flesh. As Simone Weil and Frantz Fanon have insisted, those who imagine having escaped that inscription fool themselves. This is especially true of the well-meaning and good-hearted among us, in quotes, who never wanted them to be colonized, but profit and profited, continue to profit nonetheless. As beneficiaries subsidizing extractions, hailed as development, is a stock and trade of the well-meaning, a set of practices renewed at every turn. And I really appreciated that Engin pointed out that I don't see repetition. The word that's most important to me, and that I won't be discussing today, but what I'm always ready to, is recursion, is a recursive folding of history upon itself in different kind of ways. It is not repetition. I think that's one of the real problems in colonial studies, to not inquire about what recursion means and how different parts of an earlier moment fold into a new one, and new planes become visible in that refolding. Philanthropy and humanitarianism are the goods parlayed in the process of feeling good about feeling bad, as Sarah Ahmad has told us, while the well-intentioned in their silence endorse camps of containment, forests destroyed for mega plantations, gated corporate-funded compounds, and ever more lethal tactics to render sensitive quarters more secure and well-heeled, ones and others well-heeled, more safe. Imperial formations are racial emporia, stacked with commodities and currencies of inequality, infrastructures that are unevenly distributed, resources that are so generously allotted to some and meted out meagerly, if at all, to others. Imperial designs are drawn with measures of cultural capital that are both white defined and white infested, assuring blocked and privileged access. These psychically and physically damage what I refer to in these essays as imperial democracies occasionally have their privations verbally acknowledged, but still left materially unaddressed. So all the apologies, all the sorry books in Australia, all the apologies from every government leader, to me, are just hogwash. Those others not counted among the counted are subject to forms of duress that go unregistered or strategically lit upon, then willfully ignored. This extended early 21st century conjecture amplifies as it refigures implacable futures of imperial democracies in their quasi-democratic struggles. On the one hand is a protracted moment of inflamed and threatened ultra-conservative activism, as we know all too well, and on the other, a fierce rejection both of racialized practices and those, I quote, colonial-like inequities, recursively structured, recasting ones that have come before. Boldly skewed in public attention, getting contests over the language, the landscapes of pedagogy, politics, labor, aesthetics, rage. Sometimes the substance, and I think you know what I'm all referring to, is decolonial. Sometimes the substance of the battle is on unrecognizable terrain to all interlocutors. Sometimes the battle is explicitly of the same time and place. Those bent on prohibiting and denying the teaching of colonial histories of dispossession, massacre, and violence versus those asserting the palpable, urgent need for more specific and pointed such histories may be voicing mutually unintelligible claims, or they may be positioned in hand-to-hand combat to practice pursuit over museum curation, dispossession of land, restitution payments, in short, over every object and inch of contemporary and historical terrain. It's really hard not to be struck by the disparate renderings of what democracies are built upon and what they do and need to do now, even as agreed upon vocabulary calls up different phenomena and distinct understandings of the political states and underlying principles on which the social sphere of the polity is founded. Affective allegiances, too, are distinctly oriented to the public expression of fear, shame, indignance, humiliation, anger, all emotives distributed differently, less often with resignation than rage. So one of the chapters I'm not reading is entitled Poetic Rage, the anti-colonial avant-garde, that is precisely about turning our understanding of the avant-garde away from the European center, away from Berlin and Paris, to see that these were way stations only along the way of so many anti-colonial artists and aesthetic producers and political. The next section is called Imperial Democracies on the Line. British imperialism, built on the tenets of 19th century liberalism, something we all know about now, rather than in contradiction to it, prepares us in many ways for what's followed. This is something that Uday Mehta and I, 1990, we were both, I mean, it's 32 years ago, we were working on this. And Uday's piece became the first piece I put in Tensions of Empire in 1997, because I thought it was so important and was not being said enough. The terms of how liberal democracies are understood to protect its communities or sever them, each with distinctly different rights, is what this is in part about. Even those who are critical of what democracy offers don't agree on what is called the democratization of violence that underwrites it. So John King, political theorist of democracy, I won't say much more, and it was written for decades about Eastern Europe and the power of the powerless, questions whether violence is really at the heart of democracy, arguing that the democratization of war makes acts of violence, as he says, publicly accountable. Absolutely not, my taking. Achille Mbembe, a dear friend and interlocutor for many years, to the contrary, would hold that democracy, in its very making, nurtures violence and what he would call a democratization of fear, in which necropolitics, the term that is just rampantly used everywhere right now, is not only a tool of democracy, but its core, at its very core, and a protracted death sentence for so many who have imagined salvation in its promise. This society of enmity, about which Achille, it's hard for me to call him Mbembe, I'll try, has long written, nourishes the explicit delineation of difference and this, what I call the submetrics of inequality, another theme that runs throughout the book. There is virtually no democracy separate from the colonial condition and the displacements it inflicts. The dark spaces of democracy are not only penal colonies and prisons, something which I've studied a lot in the duress book on the carceral archipelago, but they're strategically located for surveillance, isolation, and extraction elsewhere. Extractions of land, labor, and produce shape governing policies, practices, and violences in the interior borderlands and supposedly exterior territories of democratic fascist states. Imperial democracy can be celebrated or derided, but rarely is it understood to mean the same thing. It was actually a term that was used back in the 70s and for all the people in international relations on the right. It can be celebrated or derided, but rarely is it understood to mean the same thing. Some treat it as the joining of two opposed projects, one interior to the polity and its citizens, the other directed at the conquest and coercive management of subject people and sites of extraction, as if the imperial spaces were outside the nation's proper bounds. But this is not what most fundamentally characterizes imperial democracies, not what they actually do on the ground. It shouldn't be necessary to repeat it, but I would hold that it still is. The common image of a dichotomy between inside and out, with respect to those infrastructures and democratic liberal policies that distribute rights and resources, dissembles and misconstrues, is not what I'm after here. It's not that access and resources are meted out sparingly in the imperial domain outside national borders, but allotted with equity for those who are properly within. Interior frontiers do not refer to inside and outside the nation. Rather, they mark distinctions among the good citizen, the sub-citizen, the non-citizen, think of Puerto Rico, who can vote and who cannot, those with a place versus those who are superfluous and have no place, citizen versus subject, refugee, migrant. Interior frontiers are at once fierce and fragile, sites of struggle between differentiated population spaces and persons, divisions that can be silently and violently enforced. So we don't want to argue that it's only one, that it's always this or always that. That's part of its polyvalent power. Distinctions are drawn along multiple axes. The boulders are between those relegated to deprivations versus those who feed precisely off those charities of health, housing, education, and wealth. Interior frontiers can mark osmotic borders or a no man's land of fragile limits, as Andre Green writes. And this is someone at 18 Balibar, again, someone I'm very, very close to, so I'm going to call him EB and get away from Balibar or Etienne. I told him that and he laughed. He calls on Andre Green, but as I show in the Interior Frontiers piece, he only takes him so far. But this image is really extraordinary. Green's most striking observation, which Etienne EB placed as the subtitle to his 1993 text, What is a Frontier, reads, and this is Andre Green, one can be a citizen or stateless, but it is difficult to imagine that one is a frontier. Some would argue that today's template for imperial democracies is that of ancient Athens, where Sophocles was lauded for crushing a rebellion on the island of Samos. Although there was no mass enslavement or massacre, as the renowned British classicist Mary Beard contends, subservience, dependence, and debt, the Samosian's law. The semiotic politics that lauds both Athens' imperial conquest and its commitment over and over again when we teach undergraduates to internal democracy. I mean, that stands for democracy, right? Is a rhetorical ruse. It's a political one as well. Its resilient appeal clearly speaks to a confirming and comforting political imaginary for the demos today. The mytho-history is of imperial ventures as oceanically distant outside, with respect to the democratic venture, democracy as the preeminent space of egalitarian justice. A firmly possessed place, sorry for my dog in the background. Is that bothering everybody? The doors are closed. A firmly possessed place and foundational principle within the nation's fortified bounds. But this characterization misses a crucial point to this ever ambiguous play and politics of comparison. Only a small fraction of those within Athens had voice or rights. The interior frontiers were sharply drawn with slaves, women, and immigrants, as we know, excluded from the polis. In the early 20th century US, ugly laws, literally titled ugly laws later, targeted removal from public space of those who were poor, beggars, lame, Black, petty criminals, encompassing those not altogether different from immigrants, unemployed, homeless, and superfluous persons cast out of the polis state. So this was sort of 1915, 16, 17, 18. Those not protected by the normative requirements of the community protocols are reminded in every move and every practice that they are outside both invisible borders, lacking requisite competencies, deserving of full membership. So, returning in some ways to the intimate, one of the titles of one of the essays here is Weaponizing the Senses, and it's all about the relationship between sentiment and politics. Again, pushing harder, ever harder, on the theme that Engin brought up. There's also a chapter that I call, well, maybe I'll get to that. Let me tell you about it. Still, between the blatant and the imperceptible. Still, imperial democracy is not a world of clarity, nor Manichaean, as some political positions might claim. How those who move across the edges of these divisions and distinctions, and how those distinctions are finely calibrated and discerned, open to core concerns of what I'm trying to do here. That follow, Roland Barthes made a germane case in his exceptional thinking on semiotics. It's interesting that it's on semiotics, not politically grounded, where a specific issue guided his methodological work. Eberlin Grossman parses it. His approach seeks to enlarge, quote, our fields of perception and sensations, to touch from a distance, to augment the threshold of sensibility. For me, that's key. What is that threshold of sensibility? And what is the disregard that disallows that? This piercing analytic methodological insight is joined by another, akin to how Raymond Williams, much more popular for talking about these issues, described a structure of feeling. Only a few years earlier, and I think this is the key sentence in Raymond Williams' book. I'm going to start getting I don't know why I'm getting hoarse. Excuse me. And that phrase is structures of feeling are at the very edge of semantic availability. What that means to be at the edge, and not always in a verbal form, but in gesture, and that which does not yet have a language. Both point to a critical space of politicality. And again, politicality is a term really important to me. Politicality is that potential to be political. It doesn't say you already are. It doesn't say that it comes with the territory just because you're working class, right? It's something that is nurtured, animated, as a preserved possibility to really move with. And I think there's so much more potential now. Etienne Eby used that term twice in all of his thousands of pages. And when I talked to him about it, I said, I just love this, Etienne. And he said, well, I haven't done anything on it. Why don't you? And he really doesn't. He doesn't write about it anywhere. It resides inside all of his work, right? It's there. But he doesn't go in the same way as Interior Frontiers. after some 20 years, he leaves it aside. And that's what the first major essay in the book is about, is tracking how he sort of sees it at one moment and then realize how pernicious it is at another. His first response to it is that it's possibly radical. His last response to it is that it's absolutely ugly. So both point, Barthes and Williams, to a critical space of politicality, where and when the emergent and potential political can thrive. Barthes posed his problematic in a semiotic lesson on how to read. I think it's fascinating. He says, to render sensible to an imperceptibility that does not know how to know what it discerns. I would argue it's not to know what one does not know. That's, to me, really, really important. That is the name of imperial formations. That's the name, for me, and along the archival brain, how much they did not know what they did, and how anxious epistemologically they were about knowing, not knowing. Here, that stretches between what is linguistically unavailable and the imperceptible as that which one does not yet know how to know. It's a politically vital distinction, addressed not only to what one cannot yet say, which is what Williams is after, what is not available yet, but to a rendering of the sensible as a practice. A rendering of the sensible as a practice, attentive to sensory epistemics, which is basically what I've been working on all the time. Epistemology is not just about reason, and never has been. Political rationality has always been about the politics of sentiment. A way of knowing that so textures the lived experience of disparate lives. Williams rather looks to the affective elements that articulate the personal and the social as this politically emergent space. That, on the other hand, opens to a political practice and a literature as a foundational site. And here the political seems to emerge on his every page. And strangely, he doesn't talk about the political. He does, or Williams does. Nor is he really considered a cultural Marxist, right? It's Raymond Williams, who is that person with Stuart Hall, right? That offers the possibility of speaking to what constitutes the political. And that, for me, is also the key to what I'm trying to do in this book. Not what the political already is, avant la lettre, but how a redefinition of what counts as the political occurs. And that is one of the key features in Poetic Rage. So Barthes, I'm repeating please, offers the possibility of speaking to what constitutes the political, with each point of pressure put on the imperceptible and how we might learn to see. Nuance replaces the rigid binaryisms he rejects. In his accounting, emphasis is less on not yet having an adequate language to say something than on the dilemma of not even knowing how to know what one discerns. I kind of read and push him further. Hans-Jürgen Reinberger reposes that caveat again. Beautifully says it. They don't ever reference each other. Quote, one must know the method of knowing in order to grasp the object to be known. And that's where, for me, we get to what I argue is what I do is a conceptual methodology. The methodology is not over here and you take it in one course, and then over here you take work on concepts, but the ways in which the very methods you use are conceptually loaded already and are a way of entering a space without thinking, I'm going to do this in a methods course, I'm going to do that. Others have said it, but really Reinberger reduces the noise, conveying it in one sentence. The succinct formulation stops one short almost, right? Capturing why the how of how you know matters. And the how, of course, is part of epistemics and methodology at the same time, right? How I know is not only that I know. Racial formations are steeped precisely in an assumed way of knowing expressed in loquacious and carefully muted registers. The relationship between what one knows and how one imagines to know is what keeps coming up in all of these essays that I'm trying to work with. Gaston Bachelard does something really useful as well, somewhat differently grounding the how of knowing in what he calls the epistemology of detail. I love that term, that he once described as the aspirational crux of his work. This torque on the detail has guided most of my archival practice for 40 years. The anxiety of not knowing how one should know was both a leitmotif of the 19th century Dutch colonial archives, and in turn, my anxious movements following the archives. Oh, I have to tell you, I didn't know how they imagined they knew anything. And they had these kind of pat narratives, even before they saw, smelled, tasted, heard, read anything. Right? Evidential truths derived from rumor, visual proof, hearsay, emotives, and the written word, each called upon as fact, disparaged or unreliable, depending on who conveyed them, where and when. I've referred to these as hierarchies of credibility that were protean as context, urgencies, imaginaries change. So epistemological hesitance has served me and still serves me, even though I'm not writing off archives right now, as a political diagnostic. It can mark where and when problems of interpretation arise, where doubt confronts emphatic claims. It's where a problematique should be held, right? It's that very place where the hesitancy opens. Such issues, I would argue, are alerts to where interior frontiers emerge. They're not sitting anywhere, right? They don't have a line around them. You know, this is the Arab quarter, and this is not. That's too easy, I think, much too easy. Where interior frontiers emerge and reposition, how sentiments distribute social distinctions, how taste marks denigration, le goût, and how the forgotten and forgettable withhold social worth. And the first part of the book is attentiveness to the how of knowing, key to idioms, comportments, and sensory regimes of racialized attributions, and again, the submetrics of inequality. Explicit and subjacent spaces of entitlement, and that's what I'm really interested in the play between the explicit and the subjacent, right? Of entitlement and deprecation make up racialized systems of credence. Those participating in those practices that impinge on social ecologies may barely know the discernments in which they invest. They don't always know it. If it's in spaces where they don't imagine are about inequality. So one of the key chapters, the sort of central piece in it, is on the distaste, in parentheses, the taste of race, which plays on dégoût in French and goût, the taste and the disgust of race played off one another through Bourdieu and Kant. Anxiety and ambiguity aside, persons and people are still easily dismissed as if with unwavering clarity. Like, how do they get dismissed, right? If this is all so ambiguous. Their criteria imagined to be so self-evident, as if without intended political effect. Gee, I didn't know, really? This unflexing confidence providing a willingness and an impulse to subscribe, circulate through these essays to locate different sites of application. The formulation speaks to an effort to make visible the conceptual and material practices that concerted disregard and what the attentiveness that goes with it entails. So this politics of disregard to me is fundamental to imperial democracy. How we look away. What are the conditions that allow us to look away from one thing and not another? When disregard is sanctioned with certitude and by common sense, implausibilities about racism's reason may be hardly questioned at all. So that disregard allows a lot of space to turn away. Reason can be turned from itself. Disregard depends on bodily and psychosocial requirements that are not always the same. Sometimes disregard is a concerted effort. Yeah, I mean, I really have to look away from that homeless person who I know has nothing to eat. I can't give it to every homeless person, right? And I can't give money at every second. Conscious but unacknowledged, or innocently processed as inadvertently passing over, or in repulsion looking away. For adverbs can point to ethical compromise, and this is Austin's brilliant understanding. Wavering intent, couched animus. Adverbs do lots of work. They can provide an excuse for one's qualified commitment to particular acts. Oh, I unwittingly, oh, I didn't really mean to do that. Oh, I wasn't quite sure. I simply didn't see. Really, that's all it was. Unwittingly carried out, practice is hardly visible, a declaration of innocence. In I simply didn't know. Alter the claims for an act, how it is judged, and the limits of accountability. I mean, that Austin did this, but never moved to the political. It's an extraordinary insight. It was the philosopher and linguist Austin, in A Plea for Excuses, this little piece, right? 1955 essay, often taken as the manifesto of ordinary language linguistics, and left there as if that's all it was, right? Who reminded us to seize on and not ignore protective adverbs. I think that's an amazing way to learn how to read. What are those adverbs doing to qualify my accountability? The volume's final essay, Colonial Diffractions, took a great effort to write because it's really against the grain of a lot of the work on decoloniality right now. Colonial Diffractions in a liberal times turns less to the moral authority that disregard confers than to the conditions that recast liberalism's fundamental inequities as primarily colonial coordinates. So why is it constantly not colonial coordinates? If excuses are an admirable subject for exploring the range of withdrawals from ethical responsibility, as Austin held, Imperial Democracy might serve as one of his exemplary sites, I would add. Colonial aphasia, as I've long suggested, is an ultimate excuse, one that removes the need for excuses altogether, right? With a lapse of knowing as a powerful occlusion, one almost shorn of any accountability at all. Decolonizing, I defer, I'm sorry for those who are committed to it, becomes almost a conciliatory gesture. Turning the inequities of imperial democracy away from the liberal demos, as if those inequalities might better be accounted for on the exterior sites, that we need to call on that and call it by that name, rather than in the movement between these spaces and in the what I've called for some time the managed mobilities. These are not just mobile, right? They're not immobile. They're not stasis or get out of here. They're managed mobilities that have a particular rhythm to them and happen at certain moments, on which imperial democracies well, as I suggested, I've only gotten through very little of it, but I'll keep going. You tell me when, and we can end whenever. Should I stop now?
If you just like for 5 minutes to wrap up, that would be great. That will bring us just about the 45 minutes. But if you want to stop here, I'm ready to jump in and ask a number of questions to get it going. So it's up to you if you feel.
Well, I'll just tell you something, just because this is sort of a special moment that I've never given this, and it's a kind of accounting for how I'm moving through this book. And the next section, it's sort of an odd one out, is called A Set of Etudes. In the spirit of Barthes' sensory alertness, and that's what I think of it, sensory alertness. I think of these essays, and I don't call them chapters, because they're not chapters in which they lead up and there's a crescendo and they have a final conclusion in any way at all. I think of these essays that follow more as a set of etudes, not as cases strung out to resolve into a convergent set of points. Each is part of studied concentrations through COVID the whole time, not leaving my room or my desk, on a domain in which interior frontiers are assiduously and surreptitiously assembled and defiantly dismantled. The latter is the focal point, which I haven't gotten to, of part 2 of the book, which I call Dissensus in the Making, which is both archiving praxis in Palestine, and the surge of archiving that is not of the official and not about Israel at all, but about Palestine, and the essay on Poetic Rage. I ask how these distinctions, these denigrations that come in so many forms and dissensions are reworked and recharged. I think of an etude, and I just want to say, this is not a linguistic conceit. Nor am I trying to, pull the wool and say, oh, I'm doing etude and have it in my French accent. Because I do lecture in French and I lived there for so many years, a place I love. But a call to the double meaning of etude as essays that do work, right? An essay, an effort, right? As well as studies that do research. An essay is trying to do something. Doesn't mean you succeed. I think of an etude as used in apprenticeship and musical pedagogy. Exercises intended to instill skilled practice. And in our case, what we all do is conceptual methodology that assigns and helps us constitute what is the political. Not always achieved, as I said. It's not a set of abstract skills at all. If anything, it is, and I am, tediously focused. An etude offers the occasion for practicing a technique, relinquishing any claim to mastery. I use it here to suggest a set of tentative takes on inequities written into seemingly benign designations packed with judgments of worth. So you could almost say that is one of the themes of the book, right? Looking at that which is seem benign designations and that actually assess human worth. Enumerated chapters suggest a succession, a cumulative making, a narrative with crescendo, as I said, and denouement. Anticipated resolution and forecasting conclusions afford good introductions, always, offering readers a path to make sense of a book's direction. These studies work in a somewhat different way. Interior Frontiers offers neither a narrative, nor does it really seek one. Rather, it pulls on a thick thread that courses differently through each essay, each of varied lengths, tracks how the distinctions of superiority and subordination, high and low, command and subjugation are forged in imagined measures and metrics of worth. In the essays that follow, I refrain from referring to them as etudes because I thought everyone would get sick of that and they would go, oh my God, give us a break, with a sense that some readers might see it as mannered. Still, the term sticks with me to stress a poetics of politics, an undercurrent of what follows. Conceding to some convention, I rather refer to these conjoined thoughts as essays throughout the volume. So thank you for letting me just give you some sense of what I'm trying to do.
Thanks very much. And that was really a wonderful introduction to your book. It makes me even more looking forward to reading it. I'm not going to ask questions, but I'm going to highlight a few things that I really deeply appreciated in what you said and the kind of thoughts that they evoked. And then I'm going to hand it over to our audience to come in and ask their questions. I'm going to start with, I'm not going to provide a big list either, although I do have a big list here, just to highlight some of them. I've really appreciated your reflections on yourself as a writer, as an author, and not to take how you express yourself as a problem to be solved, but an asset. The difficulty itself is an asset of
it's an opportunity.
Writing and thinking, an opportunity. And I really appreciate that, because we do have these conversations, pedagogical and intellectual conversations with my PhD students. And the epistemological hesitancy or anxiety is not necessarily condoned or encouraged in the academy in its very competitive structure. And yet, that epistemological hesitancy and anxiety is, in fact, a way toward production of knowledge.
Exactly.
If there was no such anxiety and questions about oneself, one's location, one's position, it would be impossible to produce knowledge, because knowledge is not a series of statements corresponding to reality. It is much more complex than that. We are engaged in its production. So I really appreciated your thinking, like you're agonizing over etude and the notion of the essay, to try to attempt, is also an indication of that. That's an author just simply say, here are the chapters, this is how a book is structured, read it. Therein contained all the thoughts I had. It's not simple as that, because thoughts have their own histories and then their own demands of representation. They impose demands on us to be represented in particular ways.
I must interrupt you. That's exactly what Richard Bernstein and Gadamer say, that they had concept impose demands upon us. Exactly. And so few people think of what that possibly means, demands upon us.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And
that way.
Yeah, exploring those demands and responding to them, I think both creates epistemic anxiety, but also I think what makes our work both political, poetic, as well as engaged. So I really did appreciate that. I also was just really taken aback by, not taken aback in a bad way, but your comment on Austen. So I'm a deep admirer of Austen, and particularly in his little writings like Excuses, or the small performative utterances, these tiny gestures and so on, how they bring things into being. I look forward to that. Really look forward to that, because Austen is an incredible source. And finally, there are many more of them, but this notion of the interior frontier being inscribed in the body, and we are, or one is, an interior frontier, is a powerful image to work with. On the one hand, of course, there's a Bourdieusian genealogy to that, in the ways in which how bodies inherit certain norms, habits, and so on. But amazingly, there's also the modern version of this, digital version of this. the digital governing practices increasingly inscribe interiors in bodies as sensors. These sensors come in the form of devices that people wear, but also these sensors come in devices that can be implanted in the body. So these implanted chips and sensors, in a way, is almost the extreme version of inscribing interior frontiers on bodies.
Wow.
And so probably I will get back to you on this, because I am doing some work on how digital devices inscribe certain beyond norms, but certain practices into bodies and literally implanting. So far, the focus has been on digital devices that people wear voluntarily, but we don't discuss enough yet devices and chips that have been invented, sensors that are implanted in bodies for all sorts of reasons, health reasons, beauty reasons, fashion, and so on, but they exist. And the ways in which they inscribe interior frontiers is something really significant to explore. I will stop there. There's so many other thoughts that your introduction
those were
evoked.
beautiful comments, Engin. I won't take up more time since I've taken up so much. But I just so appreciate that you got so much of what I'm trying to do. I mean, it was really, really incredible. You know, we haven't been interlocutors, and we'd better be now in the future, because to be able to read one another really is what our world is about, right? I had the glory of, and I always take it as an honor, of reading with EB. And being in his first seminar, one of the first seminars on race in 1987. You know, that's a long history. What we don't have, I think, and don't take advantage enough of how much the writing and the thinking has to be in some kind of interlocking space in which we all, maybe Zoom can help that in ways that we haven't realized. Thank you. I won't say anymore. It's just, but one more thing. I am going to say one more thing. So one of the chapters I didn't read to you, please, everyone, don't. Let me just say this, because I'm going to send it to Engin. After I wrote this book, there's a part in it on the Weaponizing the Senses, which is about Carolyn Steedman, one of my absolutely people I've always admired her work, and I've taught her for 30 years. Her book on landscape for a good woman. I don't know how many of your students in London know it, but if they don't, they better know it. I was asked by a journal to write on books that matter. So I thought of all, you know, Foucault and everything that's mattered to me and this and that. I decided it's really this book that taught me and coincided exactly with the moment I started thinking about the politics of sentiment. And I wrote a 12-page, very short essay for this Books That Matter, entitled Shorn of Grace, and what it is to be shorn of grace, and the politics of inequality, and the way in which sentiment expresses that bitterness, that denigration. And so what I'm saying about writing is it wasn't sufficient. What I did in the book that is coming out isn't even out yet. I had to write another piece that was better. And what you said about writing, it's the center for me, form and content. There is no content of form. So thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think there are already some hands. So I encourage everyone to raise their hands, and I'm going to take them up in order, in the order in which they're raised. Depending on the numbers, we might just take them as groups or individually. But please feel free and turn your camera and mic on, so you don't have to put it in chat. Already I have turned that on. So without a further ado, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Bernadette Buckley.
Hi there.
Hi, Bernadette.
Hi, Engin, lovely to see you again, and nice to meet you, Anne, and wonderful to hear this fantastic talk that you've given. I actually just wanted to come back momentarily to the issue that Engin rose as well about epistemological hesitancy, because it's one that it really speaks to me, and I feel it's very important in a time where politics is so polarized, where people feel emphatically that they are in possession of the truth.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you how you feel we can open more spaces for the production of epistemological hesitancy, and also because my area of research is the relationship between art and politics, whether you feel that, and you've mentioned this book on landscape as well, that whether you feel that aesthetics can be part or kind of a productive methodology for opening such a space. I do have a second question as well, but I don't do. Can you indulge me, Engin, for another?
Yes, please go ahead, Bernadette.
Thank you. It relates to the earlier part of your talk where you were raising the question of violence and violence being endemic to democracy. And I just wondered if you could maybe say something further about that, because having worked on this subject for a while now, one of the issues that I think I face a lot here is, again, to do with people's apparent certainty in terms of what their understanding of violence is. So even within kind of political science circles, for instance, I find increasingly this return to an insistence on violence as direct, embodied, subjective, rather than indirect, systemic, structural. And of course, this position tends to harden, particularly when a war erupts, or that people want to kind of say, no, we're not really interested in the soft violences that you have been talking about. We really need to come back to, because, and often they qualify this by referring to victims of violence who they often argue suffer a further indignity by being compared to or being included in conversations about violence which are about soft violence rather than about hard violence. So I understand these are two huge questions.
Yes, they are.
If you could even address either, that would be wonderful.
They're wonderful questions, Bernadette, and thank you. And I can't do it here. I mean, we have to have a conversation, and we do. We really need a conversation, and that's why these occasions are so wonderful. But I think if I might obliquely answer the first question, and not really answer, but entertain it, is that we don't allow enough room in our courses and our pedagogy for epistemic hesitance, as Engin said before. There is such weight given on theory with a capital T. I don't use the word theory in any of my teaching. I refuse it. I think it absolutely paralyzes doctoral students, MA students, undergraduates, because they feel like that's the goal, right? Well, they'll just put in a few little empirical examples. They don't get that theory doesn't matter. What it matters is what kind of question you're asking, not the answer you have to it, but a good question. And what are the underpinnings, epistemologically also, of those kinds of questions? Because sometimes the questions tell you immediately what you're leaving out and what you're foreclosing. So if I may do that in that oblique way, when you said, how do you make more room for that hesitancy? I think that is our responsibility. I think we have to think more about really what we mean. And we always use the word radical, but what radical pedagogy is. And I think what helps a lot too is something that, I kind of call myself radically adisciplinary. I don't believe in disciplines. I think they get in the way. I think they create authorizations that are totally inappropriate. I think they also make students, I get students from philosophy sometimes who say, do you think I could come in your course? I don't do anthropology and I don't know it. Because, and I like, what do you mean, could you? Of course you should be in my course. Even at the New School, which thinks of itself as so on the edge from, right, Hannah Arendt to this, it's really depressing. What message we're conveying about being hesitant. So I've just taught a new seminar on grammars of time. We had no answers in it. It was the most difficult seminar I've ever taught. I mean, defining time, thinking about time, time out, time off, just, wasting time, doing time. we were flummoxed. It was probably one of the best courses I've ever taught. We did not have clear answers. And I find that very difficult to do. And I think the whole system mitigates against it. You're supposed to write, as a graduate student, show that you are competent in this theory and that theory. And I think it's hogwash. I don't use the word hogwash. I use the word BS, and that's what I mean. So violence, I think you said something so important, Bernadette, because this dichotomy between real violence and soft violence is so pernicious in itself. The decision has already been made of what shame does, of what humiliation does, what kind of cuts on the body, I mean real cuts on the body, young people make because of that. Cutting, scarring. There are so many levels at which sentiment, like thinking around political rationality, is not the sub thing on the side and we'll bring a little of it in. It's not that, it's not soft. It's not soft what people are feeling right now in the Ukraine. I was really honored, probably one of the biggest honors I've ever gotten is that Ukrainian colleagues emailed me and said, would you come and talk to us? I know, we know you can't come now, but we want to think with you and we want to keep thinking, even under this barrage of what is disgustingness of what Russia is doing. And I just spent weeks trying to figure out what kind of talk would be useful, right? What would be thoughtful, that wouldn't be, oh, I'm so sorry. You know, I teach about the politics of comparison. Pity, compassion, sympathy are not words that I have. They're always about hierarchy. So how do you offer something that's really could be used rather than show how smart you are? Right? That really, really can be used. And I think that's the most important. Foucault would say terms like legacy, influence, and violence are what he called in the beginning of Archaeology of Knowledge, ready-made syntheses. I quote that exactly, ready-made syntheses that get in our way. So they're placeholders, right? And they're there, and then we go and think we know what they are, right? We don't have to define what that violence looks like, feels like, smells like, right? What it smells like to be up close against another body that is totally violating. And I don't mean just rape. I mean all forms of that proximity. But it need only be proximity. I think, you know, one of the chapters deals with envy. Wanting to be and wanting to have. And why white colonials, but also whites in this moment of this imperial democracy, imagine that everyone of color wants to be them, rather than have a lot of the things they have and the rights to have those things. And that distinction was taken up by Xian Nagai, who does great work, but actually was Freud who first made the distinction. I'm not a Freudian in any way, but I was really impressed that actually came from Freud to understand how huge that difference is. So maybe I can just leave it there for now and thank you, Bernadette.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Bernadette. Any other questions? Comments?
They don't have to be questions. They don't have to be conceptual or anything. Just like something that you were thinking, like, and you don't have to be embarrassed. Just anything is fine. I mean, any level. Usually when you think you don't get it or you're not, you know, as sophisticated as the doctoral students or whatever, then you know, those are the best questions when you don't assume what you know in advance. So I'd encourage, and then sometimes it turns out students afterwards write me because they just feel this is too much of the spotlight on them. And, you know, and Engin will give you my email. And if you want to, you can write me at another time.
Thanks for that offer. And that's very generous of you. And that's also very indicative of the kind of intellectual ethics you practice. Michelle? Oh. Hi, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Yep.
I just want to thank you. I just came from a meeting with PhD supervisors about students' anxiety. So it was just so refreshing to hear you, and thank you so much. I have many reflections from what you told us, but I have one particular that struck me at a close up and personal, I think. You mentioned in the context of colonial erasure that, if I understood you correctly, you're not with the term decolonizing, because it might imply this kind of conciliatory action. I just wish that you could expand a little bit more on this. When we talk of decentering and decolonizing a particular area of study, not necessarily a discipline, but when we look at the gaze that, for instance, Europe has of the Middle East, I would like you to tell us a bit more what your thinking is in how we can actually excavate, especially through archival work, those voices that have never been given platforms. And is that what you see as the best move in order to, you know, reach out to anxieties, to this lack of confidence as well in those to come forward and say their histories and their stories, but also how groups can do this in the face of so much, you know, evil and so much, not just violent power, but power that is, when you think about settler colonialism, that you know, requires very much new ways of thinking in order to live the unlivable, so to say. Think about people in Gaza, for instance. Yeah, I'm sorry if it was just a mess, but I was thinking a lot along those lines.
I might be a little harsh here, but I think what you've repeated is very much the standard right now of everything that everyone's checking off. You know, can the subaltern speak? Let us give voice. Let us decolonize. Let us back off. I think it's really a misconstrual of what's going on. I think that anyone who studied racism would know that it's not just about those who are colonized, but is the colonizer as well. That this is a relation. It's a relationality. And if anything, I would teach courses with two people there, talking about both parts of this. Decolonizing is being said by thousands and thousands of people as a palliative, and people who don't know what colonialism is. They don't even know it. They have never studied it. They haven't even gone near the history of what it was. I find that very offensive. I find it very offensive to take it up and then assume it's the answer. We're going to decolonize the grocery store. We're going to decolonize the library. We're going to decolonize the classroom. Microaggression. You can't look at me like that. You can't say that to me. Some of it's really right, but so much of it just becomes a crutch to not really doing the analysis, not really knowing the complexity. It sets up Manichaean categories that we tried to get rid of for 40 years over and over again. It sets up the same silly, as if a monument was the answer. I'm talking about material inequities. I'm not talking about returning a piece of sculpture to Tanzania. I'm talking about where funds are coming from and where they've been ripped off from. You know, there was this big article that New York Times was so proud of on the history of the money that went to all of the French companies when they left Haiti, and that they got their, you know, reparations rather than slaves. I mean, there's this kind of a really prominent Black friend of mine who's just amazing, MacArthur. She says, why have people just all of a sudden decided they've discovered Blackness? How can this be? What do they not know? How long they've disregarded it? And how could they do it? How can they keep telling us that, oh my God, I didn't know the children on the reservations in Canada were being, put in that cemetery. Oh, I didn't know the Australians. Let's now do storybooks. Can you imagine how ugly that is to do storybooks and go home and have your dinner? No, I think that, and I know I sound emphatic here, but I really feel it very strongly that it's been really bad. And I don't think it's produced what is intended to produce. And in some places, BLM has been amazing and wonderful, but it's not even. And it's been taken up as an excuse, in Austin's sense, of not thinking. I got the answer. I know it's this. I'll stand in front of the museum and, I'll say, get rid of, whoever the general was. I don't think that's it. I don't think that's going to deal with the enormous impoverishment. If we're going to talk about this, let's just talk about who is not getting an abortion in the US now. It is totally racist, the project of anti-abortion, and totally classist, because most of it is in the South, a really, really poor population who have no access to clinics, have no, that's about, without using the word decolonizing, that's about the disparities of imperial democracies. So I'm actually, impatient with some of the things that you said, and please don't take it personally, but I think it's really important to fight that, because it is the politically correct thing to say right now in all my classrooms.
Thanks. And Michelle, thanks very much for asking the question. I think it occurred to me as well when Anne spoke. And I think, as Anne said, we have to have a conversation there because words, of course, as we know, polysemic and with multiple functions, they serve different purposes in the Austinian sense, and there are infelicities and fallibilities associated with them as well. Decolonization has a very complex trajectory, and some of which actually is really important in the way in which it expresses a particular politics, but in the way in which also it has evolved, changed, and put into different uses, raise questions at this point in time about repetitive usage. And I think that's the conversation that really is valuable to have, rather than, how did you say it, Anne, with Foucault?
Ready-made syntheses. And
ready-made, yeah. It's even the concepts that we invest ourselves in their potentiality do demand to be unpacked and shown that it also serves various other purposes. And I think that's the call that I'm hearing from Anne saying. So Michelle, thanks very much for opening that up and putting it on the table.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate it. What Engin just said really struck me too, as well as what you said. There's no conversation possible now about decolonizing. There's no conversation. You can't say, I disagree with it. I cannot tell you what, people say, what do you mean? You're not for decolonizing now? I think it's actually really problematic. I think it doesn't, and the other part of it, you can be co-racist if you don't agree with a decolonizing discourse. So it produces this whole other thing in which conversation is not possible. There's another thing that Foucault, I know I've quoted Foucault a lot, probably read more of him than I should, but he talks about the ethics of discomfort. That what we want to maintain is not to be in a new comfortable place about decolonizing. Everybody comfortable and they can go home. I'm on the right side. But about what an ethics of discomfort is. When you start getting comfortable, do you doubt yourself? And I don't know. I've seen some of my best students fall into it and say, well, I'm doing the experimental stuff now, It's a problem. It's a real problem. So And it's everywhere. It's not at the new school. It's everywhere. Thank you, Michelle. It's really important that you brought it back. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you both. That was a really good conversation. Sophie.
Here I am. Hello. That was wonderful. Thank you. It sort of pulls on the last conversation in a way, although I wasn't intending it that sense. I was thinking of Carolyn Steedman's book and how much I love it. And it made me think of another book she wrote called Dust.
Yeah, I don't like it as much.
No, it really annoyed me at the time. But I think it touches on this sense of relationality very well, and that we don't know until we let ourselves be affected about how material, in a sense, as well as sensible, these things are. So I just wanted to throw it in as a kind of take on materiality.
Absolutely.
Which, even though the book isn't perfect, is it kind of shows the knots and the funny dead ends and long ends and things that you go down, and it's a very useful, I haven't thought about this before, but in terms of teaching with people who already know what decolonization is, it might actually be a very useful way of thinking it through.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that comment, Sophie. I think the reason that I don't, I mean, in terms of materiality, the swirl of a skirt that has more yardage than one where you can't get up on a bus because it's too narrow, to me is the essence of her brilliance. This was, as she said to me, I was in 80, right after the book was published. She came to University of Michigan. And if you remember the first part of her, the first line of her book, she says, I never want to clean the bathrooms of these middle class women who are my colleagues now. And she said, and I could be if it was 40 years earlier. And I told her how much I loved the book. And she said, sort of looked at me with disdain, knowing I was one of those middle class women. And she said, it was cathartic, that's all. And kind of dismissed it, in which I don't agree. The reason I'm not excited by Dust, and I never was at the time, and we were both working on archives very similarly at the time, is that book isn't about archives. She never found a way to connect up the sensory quality that she experienced, right, in those rooms with the archival material itself, which already is so sensory. It's not there in that book. It's, for me, it's not enough of a teaching tool because it's the way that works together. The piece I wrote on her that I'm sending to Engin, you can feel that I am like dead in there with her. I'm just anguished by how to write it. And I think that's demand on us. But she didn't do that. She did a different thing. So, that was why my reaction, please forgive me, but that was why I just taught in a seminar called Documentalité that was all about archives and documents and digital documents, right? I didn't use her book. It just didn't have enough traction for me to use it, though I gave them Landscape for Good Women.
Yeah,
can't without it.
It's interesting. I mean, it is off the book, but it is such a visceral sense of what is extraneous to being in the archives that right. I find it very powerful.
You're making me want to read it again. I will, because you can't dismiss something forever, right? You've got to go back to it. You've got to go see what you missed, what you were so arrogant about thinking that you needed to dismiss, No, that is, I have so many friends who have written me about the small piece, and the excitement is how many of them have said, I have to go back to that book.
Wonderful.
So for me, that's, so I thank you very much, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That's a wonderful image also to work with. I think books are meant to be read more than once, many more times. It's not because their complexity and what they evoke, but they embody, but also the reader, the subject changes.
Exactly.
So it's not the same.
Yeah.
And having a relationship with small number of books, you cannot do this with a large number. No. Small number of books over a long period of time, a relationship is my more image of a reader rather than reader who consumes words.
I have to tell you that Etienne Balibar, EB, gave a seminar, I guess it was 2 years ago, on the book that he was a part of and reread so many times he couldn't even remember. And that was Reading Capital, that he was one of the, with Rancière and Althusser, and his talk was about reading. It was just about how to read. Can you imagine Etienne having done that when he was in his late 20s, and he's back to it in his late 70s, asking about how to read, something that he was a part of. I think that's just amazing.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. Emilia.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. I find it really inspiring. I work in the area of migration law, and I have been also triggered by what you said about the relationship between democracy and violence, and also colonialism in that respect. But not only that, so you have spoken about so many intricate ways in which racialization is so palpable in our embodiment in everything, basically. But to go back to the relationship between democracy and violence, well, democracy is a lot about the rule of law. And there are some scholars who have also made that claim within the third world approaches to international law, who say that international law is also racialized, and this racialization is manifested to a large extent within migration, citizenship law, and nationality law. So in that respect, I couldn't help but think of Tendaye Achiume, who says that probably many people will agree that it is the current state of affairs that, for example, this strand of law is rationalized, but also with what you just said. But then there would be more disagreement about what to do with this knowledge. And in that respect, I was thinking, what would be your take on the alternative ways to go about it? Because you say, okay, but democracy is kind of leading to or perpetuating relationships of colonialism and race. And then the same argument could be made about the rule of law. But other scholars have reminded us about the facilitating or equalizing effect of law. So they say, but would you imagine a world without a legal order? Like, what would there become of human rights, for example? Although, of course, you can criticize human rights as well. So you see the point, and I was interested in what you would have to say about this dilemma, I would call it. Thank you.
You're all asking hard questions. Amelia, thank you for that one. I don't know if I could answer it again straightforward. And, I mean, we all see our political activism in different ways. I almost never write books about solutions. I really don't. I don't think I have the conceit or the confidence that I know the solution to world problems, right? I mean it. I'm not trying to be, anything, but, I've worked in the politics of knowledge since I was in graduate school, probably since I was in high school against the Vietnam War and went to prison, and how Southeast Asia, I've worked in Indonesia for so many years, became Southeast Asia, which is a military command. Law is one of the places that I have just such an interest, commitment to. It's where I began my work, actually, in Indonesia, in the colonial archives. And I worked on, and was really interested. I mean, people have done it, but at that time, I wanted to show that international law was never international, right? That it was a colonial project from the beginning, that the buildup, that the elaboration, that the amplification of it was both intimate and very, very broad and differentiated in so many ways. But where I was looking at it was marriage. I was looking at how international law shaped who could marry whom, what happened when a quote unquote native woman went with a unmarried, with a white planter, and why she never had rights to her child after that, if he decided to take that child away. What really struck me too is that so much of the ethnography of the law were in the footnotes. That's where the conversations happened. So the earliest work that I did was on legal cases of imprisonment, whether a boy who is considered Lucien Vantin, dit Lucien, if you know French, so his Vietnamese name, so-called Lucien, what court of law he was to be tried in for a infringement on someone else. And the law was shaped around race. Every single detail of his being was decided that that's what was most important. One of the chapters that I'm dealing with too is the power of remorse in the legal codes in America, and the ways in which remorselessness is not the opposite of remorse, that the Christian requirement of remorse saturates what judges do and racially defines. There's no criteria given. I can give you an amazing paper on it, that by a lawyer, that remorse is required for a shorter sentence, that remorse is required for not getting a death sentence, that remorse plays out, and how it's evaluated is, are you holding your body looking down? Are you looking and at your eyes elsewhere? It's the most extraordinary set of criteria used to, in a court of law. Affect is just runs the legal system. And I have another important, for me, important, which is not the best chapter, but it's all about the law and the 13th Amendment on the supposed end of slavery that actually continued slavery in all other means. And it is the law, right, that was used for over 100 years to ensure free labor in a prison confinement of a lot of a major population of young Black men, of unfree labor that was not paid for. Right, and this was all done through the courts. It was all done through legal documents. So your sense of the importance of law is, for me, it's right at the center. But solutions, for me, to come up with how it should be, dismantled. There's a huge amount of abolition politics right now of getting. I teach in a high maximum security prison, and the ethics of teaching a maximum security and being an abolitionist at the same time. What do? Decide because you're abolition against prisons, you don't go there? And so I teach on empire. I teach on colonialism and inequalities today. And is that activism? Is that a solution? No, it's not a solution at all, right? It's not even close to a solution, you know, right? I mean, who does it make feel better? The students were amazing. And I think this stuff is so hard. I don't think anybody can say this is what should be done, you know, besides, you know, revolution and making sure the rich, the really rich, are not ever allowed in any polity to hold on to the money that they do. To me, you know, billions that we have no access to. I mean, it's a whole, it's not through the law. It's the law responds to what people want and need, should respond and doesn't. So, you know, it's not even okay to say, it's not even okay to say, why do billionaires? Why are they allowed to have that much money? Shouldn't it be siphoned off 90% of it? And they still have $1 billion. You can't say it because it's never going to be done, right? You think the law can do it and free up all that money and equalize things? Well, I don't know if we have that hope today, given what's going on. I don't know.
But can I do a follow-up question on the basis of what you said?
And then I think we're going to wrap up the session.
Okay, thank you. Of course, the solutions part is always the most difficult one. But in that sense, would you then say that you see your role within this, okay, it's not correct to say decolonializing discourse, but you get what I mean, as awareness raising, because maybe some people would see you as somebody who would like to subvert the current system, but without suggesting an alternative, if you see what I mean. Like, have you thought about that? Because I have such thoughts about my work when being critical. Like, I always expect a question, but okay, so you are being critical against or of the system, but you don't suggest anything.
Tell me what intellectual you know who has done that besides Chomsky. And he's not on picket line. Just tell me what intellectual who devotes themselves to research, to finding out how concepts are used and how pernicious they can be, stop us from thinking, comfort us in certain ways. What intellectual do you know who has, well, I think there are many whose names we don't know have put their lives on the line, not in the US or in France, right? But in a lot of other countries who have really decided that they're going to, and they'll be in, I mean, Pramoja Natatur in Indonesia, he was in prison for 30 years, right? And educated people in prison, and they read books together. And that's what they did, right? He was in prison for his thoughts, not for being, for not approving of colonialism. So it's a little hard what you're asking, because you're right. We ask it in every single class. So some of my students say, I'm going to go work in an NGO where it's really going to matter. Then they come back and they say, I'm not doing anything. But I'm giving some food out. I'm making, toys with the children. I'm being a good white girl. And then they come back and said, I'd rather learn how this matters, what matters, how we can, do something. So it's a very hard, where do you go? Am I the one that should be on all the picket lines? No, I've had this conversation with my daughter, with everyone I know. Is that the best use? Should I? Is that, I mean, there are 10,000 people there. Is that the best use? Unless I'm up on the podium, which Judith Butler has done, up on the podium, saying it the way it is, not just being in the crowd. You have to do something. You have to be asked. You have to have the profile to be considered. And they're very few academic activists I know who have that kind of cachet, I mean, my institute, I invited Chomsky, and he said he's coming. He said he answered me in 24 hours. I mean, nothing made me feel better. And then COVID hit. He's 91, and he couldn't come. He said, I don't know Chomsky's in the world. And Edward Said, you know, he had more expensive suits than I would ever have in my life, and lived a more elegant upper middle class life, and came from one. But how influential was his work? How influential in rethinking what Palestine deserves and should have? I don't know. I mean, Said did a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And he still played his piano and wrote his piano, you know, criticisms in the Nation, and, you know, loved great French food and lived a high life. He lived a high life.
That, interestingly, brings us back one of the issues that you raised, Anne, and maybe we can actually end it there. Politicality.
Yes.
There isn't a singular way of being political.
No.
And politicality is something that develops through the trajectories that we take in our lives. And it develops, it brings together a different combination of things for each person. And each person is responsible to that trajectory and to perform what being political means in that trajectory that they have taken. So that's why things that may appear from an orthodox point of view, contradiction, wearing expensive suits, loving French food, and playing piano, and being political are not opposites.
No, they're not.
It is possible. It's a question of, and yet we do, I think, tend to rather flatten version of what it means to be political, and then put them in categories, and that makes it really difficult. I didn't know actually the word politicality being used by Balibar. That's a really good thing to, you said, right? Balibar actually used that. My favorite is always being political or ways of being political, but politicality, both as capacity and constituency, is an interesting word.
I don't know if
even,
I mean, it was such a passing, and there are others who have used it earlier, because I've looked it up. But he had no interest, as he said. He wanted me to write that piece on politicality. And I think from talking to you, it has to be one of the next things that I do, because it has, I think, so much, and it's not a narrow path. I want to say one more thing about we choose our way. I went to Israel to give some addresses, and I wanted to go to Palestine afterwards. And my Palestinian friends said, you may not normalize this. You may not make these equal. If you want to come to Palestine, we'd love to have you. If you go to Israel, we don't want you. And it was that year that I signed the boycott. And I was very uncomfortable about it. And I spoke with Judith Butler, and we said, you know, I don't know if every single aspect of it, they were just making the boycott. And she said, look, Anne, do what you imagine the boycott to be for you. And I've never gone back to Israel. And I've taught in Ramallah, at Berzeit. And I think that matters more. Being from a Jewish New York girl, for me to have signed the boycott matters more than me being at a demonstration.
Yeah.
That's what those are the kind of decisions you make like that, and their consequences. There's a lot of you know, somebody asked me to do a keynote address and they had to rescind it because the university didn't want someone who signed the boycott. So
that's the responsibility that we have to our own trajectory, and that's the importance. And not everyone can be political in the same way anybody else. There is that distinction, and we have to tease that out in which ways it could be more effective. And that is an ongoing question, political question. And if there's an epistemic anxiety, there's also political anxiety and hesitancy, and that is fine.
I agree. Thank you so much, Engin. Your perceptions on all of this are so wonderful. I really appreciate it.
And thanks so much for your seminar as well as a conversation. It's been really delightful. I'm sure for everyone I can speak for. It's been delightful, and it's wonderful not just only to hear about your book, but also to engage in conversation with you. So I'm absolutely grateful for the time that you have given us. And hopefully we'll see you again.
I'd love it. It would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Maybe we can do it in person next time.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful.
With pleasure. Thank you again. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks. And have a lovely day. Bye, everyone. Thanks very much for your questions, participation, and being there.